Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of ForSpace, welcome in for this panel on excuse me, welcome in for this panel on sustainable research through open scholarship, part of this week-long series of events on sustainability and the climate crisis, brought to you by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center in collaboration with ForSpace. Today's panelists will discuss the promise of open scholarship as a sustainable path forward for sharing scholarship more, doing it better, and doing it with less. I'll let them introduce the topic more fully as we introduce the conversation. I'll just tell you a little bit about ForSpace. We are located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, as part of the downtown campus at Concordia University on unceded Indigenous land. We are a physical space. Of course, right now we're operating mostly virtually, and we operate as essentially the front door to the university. So we invite you, any of you, all of you, to come in and experience any number of interactive live events that happen weekly and daily. And while you're there, we also invite you to learn about what Concordians are working on in terms of various research projects, initiatives throughout the university, and course activities. So these days, checking us out on social media or on our website is the best way to connect. And speaking of websites, we are currently recording this panel and live streaming at CU ForSpace on Facebook. So I'll pop those links in the chat in a minute if you want to share. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today by sharing any thoughts or comments you might have throughout into the chat. It's open for you for that very reason. However, if you'd like to help us make Amy Potit's, our moderator's life a little bit easier, if you have questions that you'd like the panelists to address, we invite you to use the Q&A box proper. So pop your question in there if you're a texter. If you prefer to speak, just raise your little virtual hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask your question live. Okay, on that note, it's my great pleasure to pass things over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I'm Amy Potit. I'm speaking on behalf of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. It's a real pleasure to introduce this panel on our second day of the Sustainability and the Climate Crisis Week of Discussions. We've already had the topic introduced. I would like to reiterate the acknowledgement that Concordia is located on unceded Indigenous lands, the area that's known as Tiohtià:ke, and has been historically a location of gathering of various people, but it is an area that is unceded Indigenous lands. Okay, so then I'm going to move over to introducing our speakers. We have two panelists. Krista Byers-Heinlein is going to speak first. She is an associate professor of psychology with expertise in infant development with a focus on language acquisition. And our second speaker, is Professor Pedro Peres-Neto, who is a professor of biology, specializing in aquatic ecology and fish ecology. But of course, our topic, it doesn't really matter what the discipline is because it's open scholarship. So I will hand things over first to Krista. Over to you.
All right, hi, let me just get my screen sharing going here. All right, so I'm really happy to be here with you today to co-present with Pedro our talk about open scholarship, sometimes also called open science, and its role in sustainable research. So let's start from the beginning. What is open scholarship? Open scholarship is a new vision for research that contrasts with our historical, more typical model of scholarship, which we could call a closed model of scholarship. So in short, it's a movement that makes scholarly research more accessible and more transparent. And it encompasses many different practices and activities. One that you might be more familiar with is open access. So journals with articles that are not behind paywalls, for example. But there are many, many things that contribute to open scholarship, including open and shared data, which is something that Pedro will be talking about a little bit later, as well as open and collaborative research networks, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So one reason that it's important to start talking more about open scholarship and how we can really take this on and do something with it is that open scholarship is increasingly being mandated by our governments and granting agencies. So here's an example of the policy from the Fonds de Recherche de Québec. This policy was adopted in 2019 and now mandates that any peer-reviewed publications that come from FRQ-funded research have to be made freely accessible within 12 months of publication. And this is just an example and probably just the beginning of the policies that are going to be adopted regarding open scholarship. So why is this important and why are we talking about this at a sustainability conference? Well, what Pedro and I are going to argue is that open scholarship is a form of sustainable scholarship. And why is that? Well, as we'll talk about, it can reduce research costs and minimize certain redundant research activities, so reducing the environmental footprint of the research that we do, while at the same time, it can improve research quality. And that's something that I'm going to talk about more. So today we're going to talk about two very different examples of open scholarship, one where we're studying something quite small and one where we're studying something quite large. So my area of research is infant research, and I'm going to talk about how we have a model of open scholarship that we're looking at now in our field, trying to make discoveries about infant development. And Pedro will be talking about the other big end of the scale, some global perspectives on open scholarship. So most of you might not be that familiar with infant research. What do infant researchers do? How do we study babies? What is infant research? So briefly, it's probably something that you've seen come up in the media from time to time. There's lots of popular press articles because babies are really fascinating and it's really neat to try to understand how they think and develop. So that's the kind of research questions that we ask in my field. So here's a recent article that got some press attention from my colleague Sandy Waxman at Northwestern University, looking at the types of sounds that help babies' brain develop. And she was comparing baby talk, lemur sounds, so another primate, and bird song, and looking at which of those contribute to infants' language perception and categorization. Other colleagues, for example, Paul Bloom at Yale and Kylie Hamlin at UBC, look at the moral life of babies. So do babies know right from wrong? Do they know nice people from mean people? And more recently, during the COVID-19 epidemic, a lot of parents and educators have been turning towards infant researchers, asking questions about masks and how those might affect infants' language acquisition. So these are the types of questions that my field tries to answer. And as you might guess, it's pretty challenging to do infant research. Babies don't always pay attention. They don't follow directions. They can't speak. How can we learn from young babies? And so what infant researchers do is rely on babies' natural behaviors. So one example is we measure their looking time to different types of sounds and objects. And based on what they find more or less interesting, we can make some inferences about what they know, what they've learned, and what they understand. So to do this, of course, we have to design very well controlled, intricate studies, very precise, trying to determine their capacities. We record lots of stimuli, make lots of images, movies, and to actually collect our data, we typically invite families, one baby at a time, into our laboratory. Of course, that's not happening now with the pandemic, but typically this is how it would look like. So, a baby would be in a study with their parents sitting on a lap. You can see in front of them, it looks like an LCD monitor. It's actually an eye tracking monitor that can automatically measure where the baby's looking at. And so one at a time, slowly recruiting families, and you can imagine how painstaking it is to find a sample of babies, for example, who are exactly 8 months old and all learning French and English. We might be lucky to collect a sample of 20 babies over a period of 6 months to 2 years. And, this isn't a very large sample of babies. And if it takes us 2 years to do a single study, you can imagine how slow the pace of research can be, on top of the typical publication lag that you have. So, the research is really delayed in terms of, from when we conceptualize it to when it really comes out. So it's a real challenge. And so typically this is happening under, traditionally a more closed model of scholarship. So, I might do this study in my lab with my graduate students. Maybe we can collect 20 infants, whatever study materials we design, those sounds we recorded or those videos we made, they might be stored on a lab server somewhere accessible to my lab, maybe if someone emails me, but mostly locked away from other people. Our data, traditionally in a scientific publication, you'd publish some means, maybe some figures, some standard deviations, but that individual level data, again, maybe sitting on a computer in the lab, not typically accessible. For these reasons, lack of access to the data, usually our analysis scripts aren't shared, the analyses might not be reproducible. So no one's able to see, well, if I analyze it this way, or I look at that variable, does something change? And our methodologies are so important in infant research, and exactly the way we do these studies is so important. But actually, arguments or debates about these might play out over several years across research journals, right? It's not an active, interactive thing. And finally, some research questions that we might have might really be too big for one lab to tackle. So these are some problems that we see under closed scholarship and some of the things that make the closed scholarship model not that sustainable or as sustainable as it could be. So what I want to introduce to you today is a new vision that my field has and has been embracing over the past few years, a vision for open and collaborative science and infancy research. And it's called ManyBabies. So ManyBabies is a grassroots organization. It's a large-scale collaboration that is entirely consensus-based. So it is not top-down, it is bottom-up. It's really taken the infancy world by storm. This is a map of the different labs that we have involved in ManyBabies so far. And as you can see, we have over 400 collaborators in 217 different institutions in 47 different countries all over the world. This is entirely volunteer. We have labs in countries in every continent, and we're currently reaching out to reach some of those countries and places that are still maybe underrepresented in our collaboration. So what do we do in ManyBabies? Well, I'll show you a paper that I'm really excited about. This paper was literally published in the journal website on Friday, so it is hot off the presses, but this is one of our first papers. You can see how many authors were involved in this paper. And so this was a paper looking at baby's preference for infant-directed speech, or what we might call baby talk, looking at how infants, and including bilingual infants, prefer hearing baby talk over talk that might be between different adults. And we're interested in this as infant researchers because we think that this baby talk and this attention to baby talk might promote language learning across the first few years of life. So we have 37 different authors on this paper. And I mentioned our typical sample, from a single lab might be 20 infants. On this paper, we had more than 300 bilingual and more than 300 monolingual infants. So a huge increase in the typical sample. And these babies were tested in 17 different labs all around the world. So these babies were learning all kinds of different language and language combinations. So it's something pretty exciting that a single lab can't do. Just to give you a sample of how this looked like, we had our collaborators make sample walkthrough videos of what the study actually looked like in their individual labs. So uniquely, we got a peek into each lab around the world and to see exactly how they do things. As you can see, each lab does things slightly differently. So, you can see in this lab in Zurich, babies sit in a little kind of infant recliner. Here we have a baby sitting on a parent's lap. We have different types of monitors, different types of setups. And so in this collaboration, each lab did use their own equipment and sort of what they had available, but there was also unity in terms of the stimuli and the experimental paradigm that we used. Some important details about what ManyBabies is and what makes it different from other types of collaborations. It has a contribute what you can structure. So that means for all of our projects at any point, if anyone is interested in participating or contributing, they're welcome to do so in whatever capacity they can. So some graduate students might help with writing out protocols, other PIs might help with data analysis, some labs contribute data, other labs don't. Labs and individuals can contribute whatever they want, again, from a grassroots perspective. All of our research is completely collaborative and everything is consensus based. So the decisions are not coming from a top PI who's in charge of the whole project, who decides everything and tells everyone how it's going to go. But we've been on Zoom basically before it was called Zoom. We've been Zooming with each other for years around the world, designing this research all together. Everything we create, our protocols, our experimental materials are shared. Data collection is decentralized across many labs, so we can collect much more data with some methodological constancy, but also some variability. Our data sets are completely open, shared, ready for reuse. And those are posted on this website, the Open Science Framework. And we know that there are researchers currently combing through these data sets, using them for scientific purposes, like further discovery, but also for teaching as well. So this kind of research is not easy, and I have to admit that it's not the fastest kind of research. So the conceptualization and planning of this study actually began back in 2015. We choose in ManyBabies to publish via an article format that's called registered report. If you're not familiar with it, a typical scientific article, you sort of do all your research, you write up your article when you're all done, and then you submit the whole thing to the journal. In a registered report, this is something that happens in two different stages. So the first stage is almost like a proposal, where you write your introduction, your planned methods, your planned data analyses. You actually get feedback from reviewers at that point and can make changes based on that kind of conversation. And then once it's agreed upon, you pre-register that. So that's a time-stamped immutable record that's posted online. You go on to do the research, and then there's a second stage of review once you have your results and you write your discussion. So this is great because it guarantees that the research will be published no matter what the results are. So it finds the value in the research regardless of the findings, as long as the research is of high quality. So we have a year data collection. It took us almost 2 years to wrangle all this data from the different labs, get into a consistent format, analyze it. And finally, in 2020, we were able to submit the stage 2 registered report. And as I mentioned, the final publication of this paper was on Friday. So it's not a short process, but it is incredibly rich in the experience that it gives everyone and the data that we get from it. It is a complicated process, and such that we actually wrote a whole paper, if you're interested, about how to do this and how we made this happen with so many collaborators across the globe. So this type of open science model, this grassroots, this large-scale collaborative format has a lot of challenges that are maybe a threat to its sustainability under our current institutional structures that we have. So I just wanted to identify a few of those. One challenge is funding. So ManyBabies had extremely little funding. We had a very small grant that supported a few labs in buying a bit of equipment. Other than that, it was completely volunteer run. And it's been a big challenge for us to obtain funding. We've looked at many different funding agencies in Canada, the United States, and Europe. And there's really not funding programs that are a good match to this kind of science. So this is, as valuable as the field finds this type of science, it's very hard for us to do it. The second is lack of technical infrastructure. So we use things like Zoom, Google Docs, GitHub, Dropbox, but everything was ad hoc. And we really need more tailored tools to be able to support this kind of collaboration. Third, the incentive structures. So most researchers there's a currency of first authored publications or senior authored publications. Sorry, my daughter's just knocking at the door. Come in, sweetie. There's a tradition of senior authored publications. Yeah. Sorry.
Is the tune for my meeting ready?
No, I'm in a meeting right now, okay?
But could you just take it off?
I'll look after, okay? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just knocked on the door.
Okay. Sorry,
You
guys.
told me not to go.
Okay, thank you, sweetie. Sorry, guys. Okay. Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, great. All right, so we talked about funding, traditional incentive structure. So when you have 40 different authors on a paper, only one person can be first author, only one person can be last author. How do we value those contributions from different players, as well as technical skill barriers? So a lot of researchers lacked some of the technical skills that were needed, for example, to analyze these complex data sets. Benefits, certainly there were scientific benefits. So we were able to, in real time, hash out these contentious theoretical and methodological questions rather than having these discussions extend across years in the literature. These materials, data, and code that we have are reusable, so decreasing the amount of new data that needs to be collected. There were lots of training opportunities for graduate students and postdocs. The research networks we developed, this is something we never had before, so making connections even beyond what you would make at a typical scientific conference or something like that. And really importantly, we got really an unprecedented diversity of researchers involved in this research from all career stages and from around the globe, as well as much more diverse participants than we would typically have in a single study. We also know that this provided a fantastic model of open scholarship for those who participated. So we did a little survey after we completed our project, and about 50% of the participating labs said that they plan to change their practices to embrace at least some open scholarship practices in the future, thanks to participating and seeing open scholarship in practice. So moving forward, we have lots of other projects on the go. The one I talked about was part of ManyBabies 1. We have as well ManyBabies 2 through 5, as well as numerous spin-off studies and a methodological project, ManyBabies at Home, looking at how we can reduce the need to bring those babies into the lab and maybe have them contribute data from the comfort of their own home. So finally, ManyBabies is the collaboration that we developed that's been so successful, but we think that this collaboration can go beyond infant research. And I'll note that there are several other similar networks that have developed either in tandem with us or inspired by our collaboration. So for example, many dogs, you can imagine, many primates, as well as the psychological science accelerator. As a final thought, I just invite you to think about what kind of large-scale collaboration your field might be able to embrace. And with that, I will turn things over to Pedro.
Thanks, Krista. I'm just gonna go try to share my screen. All right. Okay, that's working. All right, so we're gonna go from babies to the planet. And the reason I want to bring the planet here is because we're interested in many things that are at large scales, but we also know that today, given a lot of the climate change and the global change that is happening with our planet in the past 100 years, we need to do research to understand and to predict how things are going to change in the planet. And this is only possible if we clearly put data and efforts together. So I want to give you a glimpse of what's happening with this and use this to showcase the importance of open scholarship and some of the challenges that we have today. So basically, ecologists and environmental scientists, they need data at many levels. We need data on climate. We need data on land use. We need data on habitat, what is good for an animal or for a plant. We need to understand biological processes. We need to understand where species are. We need to understand other aspects of biodiversity, such as abundance of populations or genetic diversity and so forth. And the goal here often is not in the particular case of trying to understand how biodiversity and the related service is going to change in the future. So as you can imagine, there will be many species changing their distributions, try to match what the kinds of climates that they are most adapted, because those climates going to shift. Then we need to understand that. And obviously on top of it, we need sociologists, we need people in economics and in many other fields to actually build the scenarios that we need to understand how climate is going to change in the future. So you can imagine the amount of data that this goes. And actually, sometimes we can do modeling at 20 by 20 kilometers on the planet. So you can imagine it's a big planet, and you can imagine how much data that takes. So there's been a lot of calling for the importance of sharing global data in general. This is one for forest, but there's this very important need to be able to share all this data and put our skills to actually make predictions about how things are going to change in the future, so that we can best preserve or understand how to cope with these differences. So for instance, this is a little bit of work of my lab at Concordia. This is based on an entire open data set that we have for climates around the planet. And this is the first map to actually map across the planet what kinds of rare climates we have today and kinds of common climates we have today. Obviously, we're not saying those climates are similar across the planet. It's just the amount of how rare and how common those climates are. And this is only possible because we have data. We don't have as many authors here because this is all open scholarship. This is data that is actually, became extremely common, and it can be downloaded from many. There's a lot of science that goes behind this. I'm not going to have the time to discuss, but basically I'm going to show you a few sources for this. And then, for instance, we can then think about it, how biodiversity changes as a function of how rare or common climates are. And you can think even in terms of functional diversity, which is another layer of diversity where we need characteristics of each species to actually measure what their function is. So basically what I'm leading here is that we need data on the characteristics of species. We need data on the distribution of species. We need data on climate around the planet. This is not in one single place, all right? There's different traditions. There's different ways to think about this. That's one challenge in itself that I'm going to discuss later. But for instance, a lot of JBeef is one of the most important open source databases for global distribution of biodiversity. And this basically comes from a lot of work, either people actually putting data in there, but actually collecting from papers that have been published for years and years and years that tells us which species is found where. So there's literally, as you can see here, those are the occurrence records, and you can see the billions of occurrence records that have been collected through time and is being deposited. The other thing that is very important in terms of to do this work globally is to have computational resources. Not only open access computing environments that you can program to use and to analyze this data, but also to have access to also share common resources in terms of computational, because this can be very, very data intense. And some of the models will be being run, could run for months, even in a very, in extremely powerful computers. So citizen science is also part of this large scale data sharing initiatives. It's something that we hear more and more every day, but this is a good example from the North American Breeding Bird Survey. Mexico, the US and Canada participates in this long-term for data collection that is standardized and based on 2,500 skilled amateur birders that goes around every year to collect information. And then this information is logged in and then is curated by different services across the 3 countries. And you can go there and download this data. This data, for instance, allowed hundreds and hundreds to thousands of papers to be published. This is a recent one, which basically shows that there's this very well-known relationship in ecology that we say that as you add number of species, imagine that if every little blue point here is a place in Mexico, US or Canada. And so as you add species richness or biodiversity in this particular case here, you increase specialization, which is then important to actually provide services. And one of the things is that this tends to be correlated and very strongly. So this one is one that has a greater slope, more specialization per species. And this is a smaller slope, less specialization per species. Not so important to understand, but what is interesting using this data set is that this relationship is decaying. We're losing numbers of specialists per amount of species. And this is only possible for birds, is only possible if we have this long longitudinal data set through time at large spatial scales that you can detect those differences. So all this comes from this data here. So this is a paper that I wrote with a few colleagues a little while back, and that we asked questions, why create and share data? So sustainability is a big component, as Krista was saying. We need to become more sustainable, and in terms of producing science, as we have more scientists on the planet, we ought often to actually do research that is a little redundant sometimes. This is not bad per se. This is not bad per se, but I'm not going to have time to discuss this. There are important points in there, but it's also important to know that the data is available when we actually need. So digital data have grown immensely in the last 20 years, doubling in its size every 2 years, and expected to grow an astonishing 44 zettabytes by last year, right? So for the sake of comparison, 44 zettabytes is equivalent to the storage capacity of 44 billion laptops. All right, so we have a lot of data, okay? But one thing is happening is that a lot of the publications that have been produced in the past, they use data, but that data was never properly curated. We're going to go back to what curation of data is. It was never properly logged. It was never properly saved. And so there are researchers showing that these papers, for instance, there are a lot of journals, and philosophies change from field to field. In my field today, ecology, for instance, there's a big push that the data is actually deposited. We're going to have a discussion on this too, what it means data to be deposited. But the point here is that they did a study and they found out that the probability of losing the data after the paper is published is about 17%. Emails are no longer functioning. People retire. They take the data with them. The students leave labs. The PIs never ask for the data to be properly organized, and so on. So there's lots of ways in which this could be happening. And so in this paper, I'm not going to go for this table, but there's many issues here, like helping solve the reproducibility crisis, less time to effort to retrieve data, insurance to protect against loss. So there's so many, increasing visibility because you're being a data generator, reducing the time associated with data handling and better versions control of the data. So there are many things. So yes, today we see data curation almost as we could think of as data museums in a way, where there are active collections. We actually curate the data through time, adding more data when is important and necessary. So as I was saying earlier, there are many stages in which it's important to think about data. But one of the these stages are classically recognized, but stages that are important today is the idea of archiving the data properly, potentially sharing and reusing this data for future. So there are challenges. Data are not easy to find, even when properly created. So in fact, we found out a little while ago that, data is everywhere, but it's not always easy to find. Many universities, for instance, today, they have mandatory data requests for collections. And Krista was saying, as things are evolving, we're going to eventually have funding agencies also requesting for that data to be collected. That doesn't mean it's easy to find it, and it's easy to structure in a way that can be used at large scales or even at relatively smaller scales. And so, for instance, you have initiatives from NSF, from the National Science Foundation in the US, that started funding this for 10 years, the Data One. The Data One is a network of data repositories. So we got to this point. We got to the point that we need actually bigger networks to actually link all this information that exists across the planet in terms of data. So one of the things that we know, and it's increasing, at least in the field of biology, this is just a sample of journals, that the number of dryad data sets. Dryad is a place, it's a repository of data that we can go there and put our data, and it creates a link that is a universal eternal DOI link that you then put in your paper so you can retrieve the data. And so as you can see, those is time, right? From 2010 to 2016, and the amount, the number of dryad data sets across many, many important journals in biology, they're increasing. Okay, that's good news. But one of the things is not, is that journals are starting to request and have policy to request data archiving for reproducibility. We want to make sure that someone in the future can reproduce the data, or change maybe the methods. Methods evolve, methods of analysis, statistical methods, they evolve, and maybe in the future we'll like to use the same data, right, to revisit maybe the same results, but using or the same concepts and predictions or hypotheses, whatever the study was interested, and revisit with this method. But the problem with this is that the journals mandate that you deposit the necessary data to reproduce your results. That doesn't mean it's data per se. So this is a good example in biodiversity. I have a bunch of islands here, and those are the number of those islands. And in those islands, often if I were interested just the number of species per island, all we needed to then deposit is put in those data repositories is the number of species, but not which species where. So in fact, this is often more important data, more complete data, because from this data, we can get the number of species, but from the number of species, we cannot get the distribution of the species. This is just one example in ecology, but this happens in every single other field, that we agglomerate bigger structured data into a smaller set by calculating averages, by calculating variances. There's many ways this can be done. The challenge 3 is that most research institutions don't actually require data archiving, right? So there is, in this paper, we reviewed this idea of data management, archiving, and sharing for anyone, really. If you read this paper, we use biologists, and the role of research institutions in the technology-oriented age. So our point of view is that we can amass data and we can transform and even revitalize the roles of libraries to actually become digital libraries, but for data, where researchers can come and actually have access to that data. But more importantly, researchers can count with their institutions to actually train, right? Train us. Many of us are not well trained to actually how to curate and archive data in a proper way. And there are many challenges, including finding universal ways and standards in which data needs to be described, something called metadata. So, so the other challenge is a bit of a change of mentality, right? There's a lot of people that they sometimes run into the confusion between, oh, if I organize my data and I put in a repository, it means that my data is going to have to be shared. And sometimes there's a lot of, well, depends on the field. There's a lot of thoughts against the idea of sharing data, because data is expensive and it took a long time to generate that data. And if I actually put that data out there and share that data, someone could come, use that data, not even give me recognition, and could publish many potential studies that don't even consider me as a co-author. So this is certainly, there's a lot of acrimonious discussions in the field about this, but the point I think it's important to make is that we should conserve now. If you're concerned, if you don't want to share your data, there are ways to think about this. I'm not going to make I believe in sharing data, but for those that they rather not share the data today, maybe later on, there are many ways to do this. Repositories with embargoes for 5 years or even longer. And there are many ways to think about that. But the important thing is to conserve. How many of us open data Excel sheets or text files with data after 5 years, and there's no way we understand that. So the idea of actually structured data and conserve data is that actually forces us to organize that data, and that data costs money, and often it costs public money. So there's some urgency and importance there. So we think that actually we need to start training students in this idea of actually and change institutions towards open scholarship that comes from from the very beginning of structuring data to creating this data and potentially sharing in the future. So in many cases, this is certainly the case in biodiversity research. We need data, and we need to generate evidence about certain phenomena that is happening, so that evidence, actually evidence-based science that we often refer to, they can have be used as decision factors for society, for academia, for policy, local communities, government, and so on. So, one of the ideas is that let's increase research sustainability via open scholarship. So Krista, earlier on, she mentioned that one of the ways to make research more sustainable in a big way and save potentially billions to trillions of dollars on that would cost literally to do that research without the ability to put all this data together and share it. So Krista and I have been having this conversation for quite a while now. Concordia could be eventually put efforts to become a good leader, a strong leader in open scholarship. One of the reasons that open scholarship is so interesting, it doesn't cost a lot of money. In fact, what is very interesting is actually putting people together. All right, so we do have computer scientists, we have library science, we have engineers, we have sociologists, we have educational people, communication ethics, the ethics of sharing, we have others, and we have lots of data generators. And even in smaller institutions today in the US, they're becoming good examples. Bigger institutions are helping smaller institutions in their data creation process. So we feel that Concordia could certainly build a collaborative culture and establish those networks across Canada and potentially the world, and be at the forefront of the open scholarship revolution. So how do we do this? Well, we need to create institutional frameworks. We need technological infrastructure. Yes, we need computers and hard disks. Doesn't cost a fortune, but it does require a little bit of investment and cultural change that we start actually working towards that. So with that, that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you both, Pedro and Krista, for a very stimulating discussion here. We are now ready to take some questions. So if you have questions, you can, okay, I see there's already something in the Q&A. Please add questions to the Q&A or put your hand up, and I will, if there's anybody puts their hand up, I'll alternate between the Q&A and the hands up. So the first question is from Arun Dayanandan, who asks, how do we ensure that young scientists are incentivized to publish in open access journals when institutions may not reimburse fees, as by open access publications from publishers that also have high impact closed access holdings? Would these institutional decisions to advocate for open science negatively impact the future career potential of young/early career researchers if they aren't able to publish in the traditional publishing ecosystem with traditional in quotation marks? So who would like to take that one?
Krista?
Yeah, I can start with that. I have my assistant presenter here with me, as you can see. Yeah, I think, this is what I was alluding to in terms of the interface between open science and traditional incentive structures. And that, historically, there's those prestigious high impact journals, which, are perceived to be the best for students' careers. And then there's the real value of open access, for example. And it is going to take cultural change, to for everyone to continue to see the value there. But what I have seen is change. So for example, in my field, some job ads are even looking for open science background, open science experience, and asking researchers to, to address that, for example, in their cover letter. So I think that change is happening, but, I agree that it's not a simple matter to solve today. I don't know if Pedro has something to add.
Yeah, Arun, great question as usual. I always like your questions. There are two things here that are important. And I want to make a distinction because this distinction. So we have open access journals, and then we have golden open access journals. And the difference is that in golden open access journals, every single paper is open. Whereas in open access journals, sometimes there's a mix, whether the author is paying for that or not. My comments will apply for both. I understand one of the incentives that is very important, and I find in itself, is particularly in my field, but there are many other fields, this certainly is important, is that data science is becoming a very important field in itself. So for instance, I've trained many of my students, and I know ecology is a huge field, and environmental science, to train students that have data science skills. And one of the important skills for data science is structuring data, is actually being able to structure. So in a way, if we establish that there is a regulatory system, for instance, that will motivate or even, for instance, today to use animal utilization, we need to actually to use animals in our research. We need to go through mandatory training. Some people are actually thinking that this should be mandatory because it involves trillions and trillions of dollars of public money. So maybe the incentive is not going to be from the goodwill of people in this generation, in your generation, or across all generations, but actually mandatory regulation. It may come along the way. And that, to me, it would seem important, especially to be in par with the idea that the public, who actually funds most of the research, would also have access to partially, because there are many ethical issues, including in biodiversity, to have all that data. So I think to me, it's a question of mentality, but also you gaining training, right? The other thing we demonstrated too in the paper, in the bioscience paper, is that people that tend to actually publish their data, and we showed this, the table has many of the positives of doing this. The citations they increase once you actually put your data to have access to other people that use their data. You're going to see that there's an increase in citations of your own manuscript or your own publication. So there are incentives there too. And we detected this using only 5 years of data, and we were able to detect already increases of the margin of 4 to 7% increase in citation rates. So and citation rates, I'm not saying is a good thing necessarily, but it's one of that is used to measure the importance of research, particularly of young researchers.
Okay, so now I'm going to go to a question from one of our panelists who has her hand up. Rebecca, if you can unmute yourself or be unmuted, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I think this is such an important conversation for us to be having. I have a question about open source publications that kind of follows on Arun's question. This obviously benefits the readers, right? I remember being in Russia in the late 90s and bringing, a suitcase of papers with me to do my research, and finding that the Academy of Sciences in Moscow didn't have access to half of the papers that I needed. So there are obviously institutions and researchers in less well-funded countries that can benefit from having open access. As long as they have an internet connection, they can access papers. However, with journals having additional, quite steep sometimes, fees for publishing open access, how do we deal with this? How do we reconcile these two kind of conflicting issues with then less well-funded researchers maybe falling further behind by not being able to publish or being able to afford to publish in the open access literature?
Who
Krista?
would like to take this one first? You wanna
Yeah,
bring
yeah.
up the
I'll take this. I think that's a great point, and there's definitely a sort of an equity and equality point there that not everyone has the funds to pay these fees. I think we are at a very strange transition point where we're trying to maintain two, you could say, ecosystems of publishing. So there's the for-profit publishing model that now has open access options, which is very expensive, but you do see other much leaner journals that are not from the big publishers that might be supported by institutions, might be grassroots, and those have much cheaper publishing fees. They just don't have the overhead. And so I think ultimately we really need to transition away from a for-profit model for publishing. It doesn't make sense that our government-funded research is making profits for these big corporations. How we do that, we are right in an in-between time, but I think once we can transition, it's going to be a lot more accessible. So for example, one journal I publish in does have publication fees, but you can apply for a waiver for those fees. And you can actually choose to donate on top of publication fees that you might pay a little extra so that those researchers who have less can have access to that. But in the meantime, we do find ourselves in this real limbo between the expensive, more vanity or higher impact journals and those emerging new outlets. That's a great question.
It's a great question. The limbo is huge. I agree with Krista. The transitioning is going to take a while. But for instance, one example, Krista was talking, PRJ, which is something that biologists are publishing more and more, and people in the medical fields too. It's not open for everyone. It's extremely low fees. I mean, it's $300 or something. And you also participate from a grassroots that you actually give your time to review papers. That's another thing that is important in there. It's there are two things that it needs to be considered here. And I am a big promoter of society-owned journals. The Ecological Society of America, for instance, owns ecological applications, ecological monographs. Some of them have been there for 100 years. The Nordic Society of Oikos, that's one of the journals that I'm an editor. Oikos, for instance, has been there for 70 years and never had fees and still doesn't have fees. It doesn't even have a number of words anymore. As the length is what you want. However, societies are feeling the pinch too. So for instance, a journal that from our society, the Nordic Society of Oikos, now went a year ago, is charging fees, and it's $2,200 American. And so we do have a little bit of waivers, but it's not open to everyone. It's causing issues. It's a more specialized journal. So it also has this. It's a more specialized journal. So not every single university or institution will subscribe, which makes it a little more expensive. Whereas Oikos is a general journal owned by the same society, but it's a general ecology. So every single institution subscribes for it. And so the management is a little. So it can be case by case, but often in the past, it was very expensive for societies to keep those journals. And today we pay the services. For instance, the Nordic Society of Oikos, Ecological Society of America, and many others pay Wiley. Wiley is the publishing house, although the society owns the journals. So I think societies and institutions will come together. That's my dream, my hope for the next 10 years. And we're pushing for this. We can do it, Chris hinted. It's amazing. This is something that if the top 50 to 100 universities or research institutes put very small money, they could actually centralize the entire publication system for free or very low. And it's not done. So there's, as we know, in society, something that makes sense doesn't always work the way we wanted it. But the transition is going to be a little painful, and but study the journals too. I think it's important to have a culture to understand the journals you're publishing and decide what best fits with your ethics and morals, and see with the institutions too. But the countries that contributed so much to so much research that they don't have that funding level, they are suffering, and we know that.
Okay, so I'll just note that we're running towards the end of the time. We have a number of questions that have come in both in the Q&A. There's a series actually here that's connected. And there's one in from the panelists, and I actually have a question, but I'm gonna, if I don't get to ask mine, I guess I don't get to ask mine. But the three that are in the Q&A, they are connected. So I'm gonna read out all three of those. I don't know if we're gonna get to the one from the panelist or from myself. Okay, so here's the three in the Q&A. So first, Brian Gallagher. Since much of the funding for science is from taxpayer dollars, is there any sign that governments can play a role in changing incentives in favor of open science and sharing data? Similarly, are any governments investing in the necessary infrastructure that Pedro mentioned? And then Jochen Jaeger joined into this discussion by noting Ecological Indicators, which is a journal, if some of you will know, some of you won't, is now completely open access and very expensive. It's run by Elsevier. As everyone knows, Elsevier makes big, all caps, profits from their journals. This is a sink for public funding, or am I misunderstanding something here? And then Brian comes back and says, building from the current conversation, is there any sign that governments are willing to play a role in shifting publications and data? I suppose it says depositories, but I think he meant depositories, away from a for-profit model. So he's apologizing for all the questions, but the questions are great. So this is thinking about the role of government, and you know, we kind of went off on you guys presented on open access research and open access data, and the questions are coming about open access publishing, which, as Krista nicely laid out at the beginning, is a form of open scholarship, but it's not the only thing that's going on. So I invite you in responding to comment on the potential role of government, not only for dealing with these problems with the open access publishing model, which myself, I just will throw out there that I find it crazy that the producers of value have to pay for it. That to me, you know, paying, you produce the valuable thing and then you have to pay for your valuable thing to be shared is just crazy to me. But you know, if we can maybe put aside the publishing aspect a little bit and think about the role of government in trying to make this something that's more feasible, more attractive, and deals with some of the problems that are existing with open scholarship. So who would like to start on this one?
Sure. So, you know, this is happening in Europe. Europe has been ahead of North America on this. You know, off the top of my head, I can't name the specific policies, but there are policies in certain European countries that you have to publish open access, policies regarding data, increasing policies, EU policies for open science in general. So I think that the funders and institutions, ultimately, and I think Pedro mentioned this, that's where it's going to come from. You know, scientists, some are always going to be conservative, some aren't going to want to change. When the funders and the governments mandate this is when it's going to happen. And it's really in their interest. So, you know, right now it's, you know, we have the feeling that we're paying twice because we are, you know, we're paying to publish our research, but Concordia is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to subscribe to these journals. And you have to pay for it somewhere. So the question is, what is our system going to be to pay for it? And ultimately, it could be a system of direct subsidy. We might want our granting agencies to directly fund journals. So there is no subscription fee, there is no publication fee. This is a public service that's offered by our institutions or agencies. So, you know, it's really about, you know, how to organize the money, how to set up this economy, and we have to think really creatively. And it's not, you know, there are librarians and others who think a lot more about this even than Pedro and I do. But again, it is going to take a transformation. And I think that ultimately it's going to be mandates from agencies and institutions that are going to push us, you know, to where we need to get to. Pedro.
Yeah, just a final comment. So England is a good example. England, as last year, I believe, their NERC, which is their national funding agency for research, they mandate that they can only cover costs of publication for golden open access. The entire journal needs to be open access. So they will cover. And that helps in general the distribution. We are transitioning, and I believe that every transitioning costs more money at one point. So what's going to happen, and the hope is that institutions like Concordia and others, they start putting their start putting money of the subscription towards publication until the system generates. Government regulating, it's might happen. Agencies, funding agencies are happening. There are always going to be some costs to publish, unless universities and institutions really take this and centralize certain fields as subatomic or subatomic physics, for instance, have taken this leap, and some of them, they have a couple of journals that literally you can put there, and it gets there's no cost whatsoever. So it will cost. My major concern is, yes, I think eventually Canada, US, Europe, they will regulate. But the countries that they don't have the funding, and they will suffer. And that's something that we need to find ways to do it. That's why I think it needs to be more international than simple governments, country governments or provincial governments. We should try to do this in a bigger picture. I think we're done, right?
Yes, so we've pretty much used up our time. Lots of fascinating things that we could pursue much longer. I agree with it. The concerns about throwing this over to the government and what government and what does this mean for, again, thinking about international issues. And also, do we want governments to choose what's valuable to publish? I don't know. So, there is the issue of the societies. My question is going to be about the tensions between open access and ethics when we think about social research, which I would have been fascinated to hear about the babies and how you guys dealt with the ethics clearance. And I don't know what Jim wanted to ask, but there's lots of things that we didn't get to. But I think it's been a really rich discussion. Hopefully, the discussion people will continue to think about these issues moving forward. So thank you to both the panelists and to our audience. I'm going to hand things back over to Anna to close things up. Thank you.
And thanks, Krista. This was good.
Indeed. Thank you, Krista, Pedro, and Amy for moderating this conversation. It was very eye-opening, as we have seen, and perhaps there needs to be a continuation, a part 2 kind of event in the coming weeks and months of this. Thanks everybody for being here. As already mentioned in the chat, we have one more event today as part of the sustainability and climate crisis kind of week of events, and a bunch more in the coming days as well. So please join us at whatever interests you. And just a quick reminder that this has been recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So just look up for Space Concordia and you'll find it there very shortly. Thanks again for your time. It's a pleasure to have you here in this space together in conversation, and we look forward to seeing you soon. We're closing up now. Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.